的，尊敬的
Distinguished Deputy Governor Xuan,
Professor Hal Scott, Miss Deborah Leyer, 尊敬的刘元春
Honorable Mr. Liu Yuanchun, President of Shanghai University of Finance and Economics, Mr. Fu, DG Fu from the National Bureau of Statistics, Mr. Wang, Vice President of CDB, and also this is Zhou Chengjun, Director General of the Research Institute of PBOC. This is an event that's organized by PBOC. So the theme is macro policy actively dealing with multiple shocks. I'll be the moderator for this event. Currently, the confluence of COVID-19 and Ukraine-Russia crisis have led to more shocks, more complexities, as well as more severe challenges and uncertainties facing China. So stabilizing price, stabilizing demand, and stabilizing economic growth will be under pressure. So given the multiple challenges, we need to leverage macro policy to make sure the Chinese economy is more resilient against those shocks. For the purpose of this discussion, we have financial regulators from around the world. We have financial institutions as well as academics talking to us about how we can leverage macroeconomic policy to respond to the external challenges. Participating in person are Deputy Governor of PBOC, Xuan Changmeng, spokesperson of the MBS and DG of the Department of Economic Statistics, Mr. Fu Linghui, Wang Weidong, Vice President of China Development Bank, Hugh de la Manière, Chief Executive Officer of Société Générale, China. And as I said, we also have President of Shanghai University of Finance and Economics, Mr. Liu, and Professor Hal Scott, and Madam Deborah Leyer, Vice Chairman and Executive Director of the Boston Institute, joining us through video link. So they can't make it because of COVID restrictions. Without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Deputy Governor Xuan of PBOC. He received his MA in economics from UC Austin, and he also received his another MA from UPenn. He joined CSRC and then China Construction Bank. In September 2008, he joined the PBOC. He was the head of the Research Institute, the head of the Stability Bureau, and then he was deputy to the chairman of CSRC. And then in 2019, he was deputy head of SAFE. And then he was made the deputy governor of PBOC earlier this year. So over to you, Deputy Governor Xuan. Distinguished guests, friends, good evening. It's a great pleasure to join you for the annual conference of the Financial Street Forum, and I would like to start by wishing the conference a complete success. We know the world economy is facing multiple headwinds and also uncertainties. There is more heightened risk in the financial system. There is runaway inflation around the world, and this is becoming one of the biggest challenges to the world economy. Also, we're facing unprecedented changes and the test of COVID. Central banks have been tightening their monetary policy, and there are signs of economic recession in many economies. Or there's also the risk of stagflation. So people are concerned whether debt will become sustainable because of COVID related stimulus packages, whether the household sector balance sheet will be repaired, whether the high leverage ratio in the financial sector is risky, and whether the investor sentiment will come back. Also, we've become more sensitive to financial tightening. Some vulnerable economies are facing a lot of external uncertainty. And looking to China, we see that GDP growth is stabilizing and there are more signs of positive growth. And most of the KPIs are in comfortable areas, but we're looking also at challenges and the test of unstable economic fundamentals. Since the 18th Party Congress, under the capable leadership of President Xi, the financial sector in China has maintained stability and achieved remarkable results. China has substantially improved its ability in the financial sector. Financial risk has been well contained, and governance modernization is still ongoing. Having said that, we recognize that for high quality development of the financial sector, there is still a daunting task ahead, and we're facing new challenges and new themes. There are still hidden implicit risks, so we have to address many of important issues going forward. The 20th Party Congress report indicates that we have to protect the risk bottom line. We need to learn from the report and make sure we adopt the Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics in everything we do. And we need to adopt the guidance of the CPC Central Committee to improve the financial safety net and also improve financial resilience. Taking the opportunity of this intervention, I would like to share with you how we can make the financial sector more sustainable and resilient. And a few technical issues to address here briefly, and hopefully it will provoke some interesting discussions. First, Basel III and systemic risk prevention. We need to protect our bottom line of no systemic risk, reinforce our financial system. This is an imperative and a priority of our financial sector policy, because we understand it's the first line of defense for loss absorption. So making sure that commercial banks are financially prudent and sustainable will be key. And Basel III has come up with more robust core and Tier 1 capital requirements. Basel Committee and PBOC have been communicating, and we've seen that Basel Committee has announced the global governance framework and also another paper on post-COVID financial regulation. In those two papers, they defined capital market tools, so liquidity cover, net stability, capital ratio, etc. So we have to improve those ratios as our metrics for regulation. We also need to improve our financial buffer and counter-cyclical intervention. It also advocated macroprudential plus microprudential regulation as the next generation framework. With the adoption of Basel III in China, we've also been updating our measures. Earlier this year, under the CBIRC legislation plan, we've seen that the capital regulation of commercial banks is now top on the agenda. Of course, there are some weaknesses in terms of financial risk mitigation in the Basel papers, because it still revolves around financial regulatory metrics, and it's still just about repair and maintenance. And it's still very much about operational risk improvement, and it has not touched the underlying risk. To protect us against systemic risk, we will have to require other types of measures, horizontal measures. Second, the deposit reserve system has to be improved. This is how we prevent a run on the bank and make the financial safety net stronger. After many years of extensive research and public comment solicitation, in 2015, China implemented the draft implementation rules on deposit insurance. And there is about 4,100 such institutions in China that have joined the program. This is to protect depositors and to make sure there is market-based risk management and resolution framework. This is also a sustainable framework for risk management in the banking sector. We can see that the instrument has become more valuable. For example, in the resolution of Baoshang Bank, the deposit insurance scheme has really made a difference. For example, it helped with early intervention and then the risk identification. It has gradually played a part, and it will have a stronger discipline on banks, and it will help us timely resolve many of the financial risks and make sure the financial safety net is stronger. Thirdly, I would like to talk about the macroprudential regulation. After GFC in 2018, in terms of countercyclical interventions and the prevention of risk contagion, we've been improving our toolbox, and we've adopted macroprudential policy. This has already become a global consensus. Improving macroprudential regulation to sever the risk contagion across borders, across sectors, is now a global action. And this is helping to incorporate some of the FIs into the framework. Globally, major economies have had very loose monetary policy and money supply, and there's been a lot of bubbles building up in the asset classes, and financial instruments have become more complex.
For example, recently the UK government tax reduction plan has led to volatility in the financial market. As a result, the monetary policy was readjusted to stabilize the financial market. China has also got progress of macroprudential. For example, China formulated the document on the establishment of a counter-cyclical buffer mechanism, and later macroprudential policy guidance was also formulated for the central bank how to implement macroprudential, how to cooperate with monetary policy so that we can establish dual pillar framework. It is still a topic we need to further discuss. The fourth topic I'd like to talk about is to strengthen the loss absorption capacity of G-SIBs. The G-SIBs, they are very complicated. They are very large in terms of size. They have strong correlations with other financial institutions. They provide critical financial services. They are very critical to the stable operation of a financial system. During the GFC 2008 in Western countries, by bailing in and by buying problem assets, Western countries rescued those large banking groups. They've paid very high public cost. As a result, public burden is increased. There also occurred a too big to fail risk. There was also political implications. The total loss absorption capacity, TLAC, was proposed in this background. TLAC emphasizes that the shareholders should absorb loss first of all, and the cost of a public fund should be reduced. As a result, we are able to address the too big to fail issue in 2015. The Financial Stability Board officially released a TLAC document. As a result, TLAC was put upon the G-SIBs in the world. G-SIBs in the process of operation should have a full TLAC capacity and a capital adequacy. In case of disaster risk, they should be able to bail in first of all. They should be able to save themselves. They need to maintain the continuity of their core business. They should try to minimize the use of public capital, or they should try to minimize the bailout. Right now, TLAC International Standard has become a very important document for the relevant stakeholders to evaluate the financial sector stability. Since 2011, Bank of China, ICBC, Agricultural Bank of China, and China Construction Bank are recognized as GSIBs in the future. Communications Bank of China, China Merchant Bank probably will also be recognized as GSIBs. To strengthen China's GSIBs TLAC development, make sure that they have the full absorption capacity. It is very helpful for China to strengthen financial stability and health. It is helpful for us to guard against systematic financial risk. In October last year, the PBC, the Ministry of Finance, and other related governments departments formulated a document for China's GSIBs, also proposed TLAC requirements. We established the comprehensive TLAC framework. It is helpful for us to strengthen the capacity of GSIBs to serve the real sector. It is also helpful for China to strengthen the financial stability. In April this year, PBC, CBIRC formulated another major document about TLAC, non-capital bond issuance of GSIBs. In China, we formulated the creative instrument officially. As a result, we're able to further expand China's GSIBs TLAC sources. And also, as a result, we're able to further broaden the products offering in the bond market in China. For GSIBs, we have established the TLAC regulation framework for TLAC definition, composition, the requirements, the supervisory inspection, and information disclosure. We have had very comprehensive requirements. We should say that TLAC framework, compared with the international financial regulatory framework, we have a consistency there. We also consider China's characteristics as well. To put it specifically, firstly, we make it clear that TLAC standard is established. The existing instruments loss absorption priority was established. Secondly, we allow deposit insurance fund is integrated into TLAC. Thirdly, we also set up a TLAC, the capital utilization rules. We also make a TLAC regulation with China's GSIB institutional development integrated together. We also look at the resolution plan of GSIBs and also the recovery plan of GSIBs. As to how to further promote TLAC in China, I would like to share with you my following thoughts. Firstly, we will make sure that GSIBs in China can establish their TLAC internal management mechanism. They should formulate a medium and long-term TLAC plan. In 2025 and 2028, they are able to meet TLAC's two-staged regulatory requirements. Secondly, TLAC instruments further supplements should be established. TLAC non-capital bond issuance system should be further improved. We should also further cultivate the market. We should continue to strengthen the TLAC bond market. We need to further improve the environment of issuance, and we need to encourage China's GSIBs to go abroad to issue such non-capital bond instruments. Fourthly, we need to further strengthen legislation. On the basis of related regulations, we need to further study how to further improve the information disclosure related to TLAC. In this, we were able to further improve China's TLAC system. And also, as a result, the resolution of GSIBs can be further strengthened. Meanwhile, we can also use the opportunity of the revision of commercial bank law to further clarify the priority of the bankruptcy of banks. As a result, the TLAC resolution priority and the TLAC capacity priority can be further clarified. We are able to better protect the legitimate rights of the creditors in the resolution process. Finance is very critical, especially in terms of risk management. To manage risk is very important in the financial sector. We will continue to stick to the thought of Xi Jinping. We will continue to study the spirit of the 20th National Congress of the CPC. We will further strengthen our awareness. We will further consolidate our confidence. We will further follow the financial development pathway with Chinese characteristics. We will further promote financial stability. We will establish the long-term mechanism of financial financial regulation. In the end, I would like to thank all of you for your support for the financial work. I'd also like to thank you for your support for the PBC. I'd like to congratulate the annual conference of Financial Street Forum. Once again, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Deputy Governor Xuan, very much for your very comprehensive introduction. In the report of the 20th National Congress of the CPC, it's made it very clear that we need to make sure we don't have a systematic risk. Just now, Mr. Xuan talked about how to further strengthen financial stability, long-term mechanism development. That is a very critical issue. He talked about Basel III, as well as the prevention of systematic financial risks, how to implement the deposit insurance mechanism and macroprudential system, as well as how to strengthen G-SIB's TLAC capacity. Those are four very important aspects. He gave us a very detailed introduction on those four aspects. He elaborated very well on those aspects. We should say that G-SIBs, the TLAC, now for G-SIBs in China, was only launched 1 year ago. The non-capital bond, actually, the related management rules were only formulated in April this year. To some extent, it's still brand new. So Mr. Xuan has given us a very detailed introduction on this new topic. I believe to further promote the development of a financial safety network, further strengthen financial stability, these thoughts are very important. Thank you, Mr. Xuan. Next, I would like to give a floor to our next speaker, Emeritus Professor of Harvard Law School, Professor Hal Scott. Professor Hal Scott is an Emeritus Numera Professor of International Financial System at Harvard Law School. He's also a visiting professor of Tsinghua University. He once worked in the American Stock Exchange not long ago. Together with Tsinghua University, he joined a very interesting online event with us. Today, he especially asked his assistant to call me to express his regret that he's not able to come to this conference personally. I had also like to take this opportunity to say hello to his old friends, including Mr. Xuan. He's especially made a video speech for us. Just now, his assistant said that he values this opportunity very much. He's given very full preparations for this speech. Now, let's listen to his video speech.
My talk today concerns the prospect of a decoupling of U.S. and Chinese capital markets, whereby U.S.-listed Chinese companies would be required to delist from U.S. exchanges as soon as 2024. Research being conducted by the Committee on Capital Markets Regulation, which I direct, shows this decoupling would be harmful to both Chinese companies and U.S. investors. Trading volume in U.S.-listed Chinese companies is also increasing, an increasing important contributor to overall trading volume in U.S. equity markets. From 2010 until 2020, trading volume in U.S.-listed Chinese companies steadily increased from approximately 2% of overall trading to an average of 6%. U.S. institutional investors own a significant percentage of the shares of U.S.-listed Chinese companies. These holdings grew from roughly 5% of total capitalization of U.S.-listed Chinese firms in 2010 to more than 20% in 2020. Between 1991 and 2021, approximately 7% of IPOs by Chinese companies occurred in the United States, and roughly 22% occurred in Hong Kong. U.S. IPOs by Chinese companies are larger on average than IPOs in mainland China or Hong Kong, and represented around 15% of proceeds raised by Chinese companies in the United States and mainland China combined since 1991. Since 1991, approximately 60% of U.S. listings by Chinese companies have come from the technology and consumer sectors. Based on the increasing use of U.S. markets by Chinese companies who could have alternatively listed in other jurisdictions, including mainland China and Hong Kong, access to U.S. markets has become very important to Chinese companies. So let me turn to the audit dispute. The dispute between U.S. and Chinese regulators regarding audit inspections threatens the continued ability of Chinese companies to list shares on U.S. exchanges. Although authorities recently reached an agreement intended to resolve the dispute, compliance remains untested, and prior agreements have failed to produce a lasting resolution. The risk of a mass delisting of Chinese companies thus remains. The SEC requires U.S.-listed companies to provide audited financial statements to investors. Accounting firms, whether located in the U.S. or abroad, that prepare or issue an audit opinion with respect to any U.S.-listed companies are required to register with the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, the PCAOB, and submit to PCAOB inspection and produce audit work papers upon request. Chinese authorities have prevented Chinese accounting firms in the past, including the Chinese affiliates of the 4 largest U.S. accounting firms that do audit most U.S.-listed Chinese companies in China, from sharing key records and information with the PCAOB, citing national security, state secrets, and sovereignty concerns. The lack of audit inspection access raises legitimate concerns for the SEC and PCAOB as to the quality of financial statements of U.S.-listed Chinese companies. In December 2020, Congress enacted the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act, the HFCAA. The HFCAA effectively mandates the delisting of a company's shares if the SEC determines that the PCAOB has been unable to carry out adequate audit inspections or investigations with respect to that company for 3 consecutive years. In September 2021, SEC Chair Gary Gensler stated that he expected that the SEC would begin identifying non-compliant issuers in early 2022, and that in 2024, the SEC would prohibit trading in the shares of companies that have been non-compliant for the 3 years. In August 2022, the PCAOB and CSRC reached an agreement that purports to provide the PCAOB the necessary access to inspect audit work papers of U.S.-listed Chinese companies. However, major questions remain as to the extent of the CSRC's control over these inspections, among other details. The SEC has cautioned that they will require full compliance with the agreement, and the delisting will occur if the SEC is not satisfied that the PCAOB has been able to conduct complete inspections and investigations under the agreement. So, what are the benefits to Chinese companies from a U.S. listing? Our research shows there are 3 benefits. First, is less underpricing of their IPOs compared to pricing in mainland China. Using first-day returns, whether prices rise compared to the IPO price, the underpricing spread between mainland China IPOs and U.S. IPOs of Chinese companies, calculated as the difference between first-day returns for both, is 45.7%. Based on U.S.-listed Chinese total IPO proceeds of $118 billion, the 45.7% underpricing spread implies that Chinese firms left $53.9 billion fewer dollars on the table by listing in the United States as compared to mainland China. Reducing underpricing of IPOs would therefore appear to be a significant benefit for Chinese companies from U.S. listings. However, our research also demonstrates that Hong Kong IPOs of Chinese companies had lower first-day returns, 12%, than U.S. IPOs of Chinese companies. This suggests that Hong Kong IPOs experienced less initial underpricing compared to U.S. IPOs of Chinese companies. Second, if a Chinese company can lower its cost of capital by listing in the United States as compared to listing in mainland China or Hong Kong, then the ability to list in the United States provides a clear benefit to Chinese companies. Cost of capital is a weighted average of cost of debt and cost of equity. Each component is affected by a firm's capital structure. We find that the average net US dollar cost of debt for US listed Chinese firms is 3.2% or 130 basis points lower than the 4.5% for both Hong Kong and mainland listed firms. So here a clear advantage of listing in the US. US listed Chinese firms have an average cost of equity capital of 7.4%, which is approximately 90 basis points lower than the Hong Kong listed firm's average cost of equity of 8.3% and 110 basis points lower than that of mainland China listed companies at 8.5%. The weighted cost of capital was calculated by combining a company's cost of equity with net cost of debt in proportion to equity and debt shares of the company's capital structure. Overall, U.S. listed Chinese firms have a pooled average of U.S. dollar weighted average cost of capital of around 6.5%. This is 100 basis points lower than mainland China listed firms. Weighted average cost of capital of 7.5% and 90 basis points lower than Hong Kong listed Chinese firms. However, when, and this is important, when one controls for characteristics that influence cost of equity, such as size, leverage, sector, return on assets, and time, the advantage of cost of capital for Chinese firms listing in the U.S. as compared to Hong Kong disappear. Thus again, Hong Kong provides Chinese firms with the same relative cost of capital as a U.S. listing. Third is the question of whether a U.S. listing increases Chinese companies' actual performance in China. After controlling for the effects of other variables, we find that a U.S. listing will increase mainland industry return on assets by around 220 basis points, suggesting that enhanced competition and industry performance in China is a significant benefit for Chinese companies from access to U.S. listings. However, we did not determine whether a Hong Kong listing has a similar effect. So overall, in terms of benefits to Chinese companies, it appears that they could get the same benefits in Hong Kong that they get in the United States. However, this is somewhat uncertain. It really depends on, whether there are other possible variables we needed to control for that we did not. And let's turn to the benefits to U.S. investors from a Chinese listing. The importance of U.S. listings by Chinese companies to U.S. investors depends in part on the relative cost of trading the shares of Chinese companies on U.S. exchanges compared to offshore exchanges. It also depends in part on how these companies have performed for U.S. investors. For example, if a U.S. listed Chinese company has weak operating performance and below average return for U.S. investors as compared to other U.S. publicly listed companies, then the importance of continuing to allow Chinese companies to list in the U.S. may be diminished, since the benefit of diversification to U.S. investors may not outweigh the difference and lower difference in returns. So how does this really work out the basis of research? Past research by Program on International Financial Systems, which I also had, demonstrates that trading costs in U.S. equity markets is lower than in the other 5 major equity markets, which includes mainland China and Hong Kong, as well as the European Union, UK, and Japan. In 2019, average total trading costs for institutional investors, consisting of price impact costs and commission costs, in the United States were 35.7 basis points compared to 47.5 basis points in Hong Kong and 52.9 basis points in mainland China. As such, any relisting of a Chinese company to Hong Kong from the U.S. or to a mainland exchange would likely result in higher trading costs for U.S. investors holding shares of those relisted companies. Second, U.S.-listed Chinese firms outperform U.S. firms of comparable size and industry group in terms of return on assets. That is, U.S.-listed Chinese companies are more effective than their U.S. peers at converting assets to earnings and converting sales to profit. A higher operating efficiency, as measured by return on assets of U.S.-listed Chinese companies, suggests that they can be valuable investment opportunities for U.S. investors as larger cash flows accrue to the investor in the long run. So investors really do want to continue to be able to invest in these companies. However, Chinese companies have a significantly lower average Tobin Q, which is the multiple of a company's market to its book value. This captures a company's ability to generate market valuation premium over book value. The Q of Chinese companies, 2.245, is less than the U.S. peers of 2.661 based on our research. This suggests that Chinese companies may be undervalued relative to their U.S. peers as they command lower market value per unit book value, despite having higher operating performance along other dimensions. This makes them somewhat less attractive to U.S. investors because the multiple is low. So this is kind of a mixed bag. Third, one can look at stock return performance over time. If U.S.-listed Chinese stocks outperform their U.S. peers, it would reduce the extent to which U.S. investors can mitigate the cost of a delisting by reallocating their portfolios to domestic stocks. Over 2001 to 2020, U.S.-listed Chinese firms did significantly outperform both the market and the portfolio of their U.S. peers. Cumulative returns to U.S.-listed Chinese firms as of the end of 2020 were 8%, nearly 500 basis points higher than that of their U.S. peer company, approximate 3% cumulative return. We focus on the 20-year period of 2001 to 2020 because the returns of U.S.-listed Chinese companies have been negatively impacted since 2021 by the potential threat of U.S. delisting. Fourth, one can look at whether U.S.-listed Chinese companies provide risk-return benefits to an investor's balanced portfolio. As in the case of stock return performance, any such benefits would reduce the extent to which U.S. investors could mitigate the cost of a delisting by reallocating their portfolio to domestic stocks. Over the period of 2001 to 2020, U.S.-listed Chinese firms did outperform the U.S. market while also maintaining a low correlation to the market. U.S.-listed Chinese firms correlation of 0.70 with the U.S. market and higher excess returns of 13.88% suggest that adding these companies to a portfolio of only U.S. common shares can have significant diversification, and return benefits. All of this indicates that U.S. investors want continued access to Chinese stocks. Because Chinese stocks have enjoyed higher returns and lower market correlation, an efficient portfolio allocation would, in theory, overweight these stocks. In other words, an efficient portfolio would allocate more than 1.75% to Chinese companies. Finally, the listing of Chinese shares can increase the effect of the U.S. investors' home bias. Home bias refers to investors' tendency to hold a larger fraction of their financial assets in companies listed on domestic exchanges and a smaller fraction in companies listed on foreign exchanges than traditional asset allocation models that optimize risk-return trade-offs would recommend. The home bias of U.S. investors is documented in past empirical research. For example, researchers at the Federal Reserve found in 2008 that U.S. investors doubled their holdings in foreign stock once the stocks are listed on either the New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ. Though the extent of U.S. investors' home bias has been declining over time, it remains a non-trivial factor. Home bias implies that the allocation of a U.S. investor's portfolio to Chinese companies will deviate further from a risk-return optimized portfolio to the extent these companies cease to be listed on U.S. exchanges. The delisting of these companies may thus negatively affect U.S. investors' return. However, given the declining significance of home bias, the effect of any increase in home bias resulting from the listing of Chinese companies may be somewhat limited. Finally, one must recognize to some extent the short-term effect of delisting, because these delistings in and of themselves represent cost to these companies and could therefore affect the return of U.S. investors. The mere delisting and relisting cost to the companies of carrying out the process will be a one-time hit on the earnings of these companies and thus the return to their shareholders, but nonetheless it is a one-time hit. Let me summarize the benefits for U.S. investors. There are significant benefits for U.S. investors from U.S. listings of Chinese companies. First, and a clear benefit, is they allow U.S. investors to avoid the higher cost of trading in offshore markets. Second, U.S. listings of Chinese companies have strong operating performance and historic returns when compared with other U.S. public companies, and can thereby present attractive investment opportunities for U.S. investors. Third, incorporating U.S. listed Chinese companies into an investment portfolio can enhance the diversification and risk-adjusted returns for U.S. investors, and it is not clear whether U.S. investors could get the same benefits by by investing in these same Chinese companies in other markets. Finally, such listings potentially reduce the home bias of U.S. investors, thereby optimizing U.S. investors' portfolio for the significance of this, although the significance of this effect is decreasing. So, in summary, in considering delisting from the U.S., there is no decisive cost to Chinese companies if they choose to switch to Hong Kong as opposed to the mainland. There is no advantage with respect to underpricing or cost of capital between the U.S. and Hong Kong. And it is unclear whether a U.S. listing provides greater improvements to operating performance between the U.S. and Hong Kong. We just couldn't really figure that out. On the other hand, the loss of better trading conditions in U.S. markets represents a clear significant cost to U.S. investors who wish to retain the performance of diversification benefits in investing in Chinese issuing. It is, however, unclear to what extent these performance and diversification benefits would be negatively affected by a relisting on a foreign exchange. All of this analysis looks at the current state of play. Markets can change and change rapidly. For example, U.S. capital markets are undergoing potential radical changes due to an aggressive regulatory agenda of SEC Chair Gensler. This can make them less attractive to U.S. investors who might be even better off investing in Chinese companies elsewhere than the U.S., including China, and whether in Hong Kong or in the mainland. By the same token, if Chinese authorities were to increase their control over Chinese stock markets in terms of tech and other companies, the attractiveness of mainland and even Hong Kong markets could decrease. Further, the expulsion of Chinese companies, changing their listings to China, might lead to better, more liquid markets in China itself in the longer run, whether in Hong Kong or mainland, thereby taking away this U.S. advantage of trading in the United States. From this perspective, these delistings could make the U.S. capital market less competitive with China in the future. Furthermore, the linkage of U.S. and Chinese capital markets cannot fully be assessed in a vacuum without considering the linkage of the delisting issue to other linkages between U.S. and Chinese markets. If Chinese companies were to be expelled from the U.S., would the Chinese continue to permit liberalization of the ability of U.S. financial institutions to expand their presence in China? Could China not achieve the same benefits from such expansion by just granting access to financial institutions from other developed countries? And what about the impact on increasing U.S. control of foreign direct investment by Chinese companies in the U.S. through expansion of the reach and intensification of the CFIUS process, or the limits the U.S. is putting on Chinese imports of U.S. Into the U.S., or the ability of firms to engage in foreign direct investment in China. And needless to say, any military hostilities would throw a big monkey wrench in all linkages between the two economies. Hopefully this will not occur. Thank you very much.
Professor Scott, in my opinion, has given us a very impressive presentation. On the one hand, I believe it is very detailed and very convincing. On the other hand, his opinions are not only very rational, but also, more importantly, really should be thought about very carefully by the regulators of the two countries, especially the regulator of the United States. The global economy is faced with unprecedented shocks right now. Countries need to further strengthen cooperation. How to further strengthen such cooperation? I believe for every stakeholder, we need to think about it very carefully. Professor Scott gave us a very stringent academic perspective. He introduced very detailed statistics, especially long time series of statistics to conduct his study. He highly recognized the Chinese company listed in the United States. Their listing in the United States to those Chinese companies themselves, to the American capital market, and also to the American investors have made major contributions. He's also very optimistic about such a role of those Chinese companies in the U.S. market. He gave us a very rational analysis framework. Through this analysis, we are able to see that the contribution of those Chinese firms to the increase of return on investment in the American stock market, as well as the diversification of American investors. By 2020, the Chinese companies listed in the United States, a cumulative return reached 8% on average, higher around 500 basis points higher than that of American listed companies. So thank you very much, Professor Scott, from the investment theory and from the practices of Chinese companies listed in the United States. He gave us a full introduction of the optimized allocation of resources worldwide. Such allocation can bring win-win outcomes to all the participants in the market. We're also very glad to see that this year the regulators of the two countries signed the cooperation agreement on audit according to the agreement, and also following the laws and regulations of the two countries according to the principle of reciprocity. The two regulators have formulated a cooperation framework. As far as I know, at present, the related on-site inspection cooperation has been carried out in Hong Kong. So this has been emphasized by Professor Scott again, the importance of Hong Kong capital market. I believe that as a professional, practical, and mutually beneficial cooperation is continuously carried out, the regulators of China and the United States will be able to find the appropriate pathway of audit regulation cooperation. Countries can conduct such full cooperation in order to further strengthen the regulation of the capital markets and contribute to the efficiency and return and effectiveness of the market. Thank you, Professor Scott, once again. Thank you all. With that, let's take a break of 5 minutes. We will start the second session, the panel discussion, in 5 minutes.